Good evening. It is just so wonderful to see this many people. Thank you for allowing us to hold. We had a number of students show up for this talk, and we really wanted to make sure that we could accommodate everyone. So thank you for your patience. I'm Matthew McClendon. I'm the director and CEO of the McNay Art Museum, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this, the third evening in our Birdsong, Brackenridge Birdhouse Exhibition Conversation Series. We are delighted to have you with us tonight as we continue these inspiring conversations. First and foremost, we extend our sincere gratitude to the generous sponsors whose support and collaboration has made this series possible. Brackenridge Park Conservancy, ICAA Texas Chapter, AIA San Antonio, and Lucifer Lighting Company. Your partnerships allow us to bring insightful discussions to our community, enriching our understanding of the built environment and its role in shaping our lives. Thank you. Yes, clap. That's your cue. As the first modern art museum in Texas, the McNay itself stands as a testament to the power of architecture to inspire and transform. From the historic Spanish colonial revival home of Marion Kugler McNay, our founder, to the most recent addition, the Jane and Arthur Stearns Center for Exhibitions, designed by Jean-Paul Viguier, our museum is a living dialogue between tradition and innovation. We are already planning for the next in this successful series, so please watch this space for an upcoming conversation with AIA Gold Medal recipient Marlon Blackwell, John T. Edge, director of William Faulkner's Greenfield Farm, and noted Faulkner scholar Stephen Monroe as they discuss Marlon Blackwell's design for the Greenfield Farm Writers' Residency. Thank you for being here tonight. I know that you will enjoy this presentation, and now I will turn things over to Gilbert Matthews to introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Well, hello. It's my pleasure to introduce my neighbor and good friend, Michael Imber, who's speaking with us on his new book, The Art of the Architect. The last time I introduced Mike was in 2013 in California when he published a work called Ranches, Villas, and Houses. Did I get that right? Mike is the principal architect of Michael Imber Architects, a modern classical firm. We'll let him explain that, modern classical, based in San Antonio. He's been honored with numerous design awards. Most significantly in 2007, he received the Arthur Ross Award for his commitment to the classical tradition. That's a very high honor in this country. In 2008, he was inducted into the American Institute of Architects College of Fellows for his contributions to American design. Michael's remarks this evening reflect his love for drawing and storytelling. Storytelling in architecture, and as will be seen in his presentation. He's a graduate of Notre Dame.
Texas Tech.
What?
Texas Tech.
Really? Okay. Well, I thought I'd spent time with him over the years, and I want to tell you, I actually went on the internet because Notre Dame has an amazing program in drawing, and I just assumed that he went through it. So I'm gonna use what I'm following with because it's applicable. So, you know what? Their curriculum is called Hand in Hand, believing anyone can learn to draw. And I wanted to say that Mike took this course very seriously. So, you're going to see a lot of beautiful sketches and artwork this evening. These sketches allow Mike to provide visual cues to communicate his vision to his team, contractors, and clients. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give Michael Imber A hearty Texas welcome.
Thank you, Matthew and the McNay. Thank you, Gilbert. And although I did go to Texas Tech, we do have a lot of Notre Dame kids in our office who know how to draw, so close. I wanted to start with talking about this, this easy button that we have in our hand. This thing that allows us, at a touch of a button, we can do almost anything. We can take pictures. We can order clothes that show up on our front porch. We can order food. We could even change our appearances if we want to. But up here I have this craftsman in Maine. He wakes up every morning to work with his hands, his heart, his mind. If with this view of his world he can connect to us, human to human, then you will treasure his work. It will mean something to you, and in turn, it will embody his spirit, and his life will have meaning. So, what of this book? This book isn't only about drawing. It's how we see the world as architects, and how we take that information and conjure a thing in our head. And almost like alchemy, take an idea to physical form. That most direct cognitive path from a pencil to our brain. And how today we have moved from a world of representation to a world of simulation. What are we missing? So, we're not afraid, even though we draw a lot in our office, we're not afraid of these buttons. And so, we decided, well, we'll just look at AI, and I'll ask AI, picture Michael Imber, a Texas architect, in his studio in Maine, as a writer, as a craftsman, as an artist, and what would that look like? What's this look like? What, you don't think I could do the beard? And I think this is a good example. You could hit a button and it's easy, but there's a gap, right, of what you saw in your head and the reality of what you get on the page. So, I grew up in West Texas, and there was an Indian legend of the great creator who, after the creation of this beautiful world, threw all his rubbish in a huge pile in the far reaches of West Texas. So, as a kid, we used to pile into, the station wagon, and my dad would take us all throughout West Texas to all these Indian burial grounds and to Texas forts and, to all of these things that, became a part of who I was as a child. This is a painting that is up in Fort Worth. It's probably 16 feet tall by 36 feet long or 40 feet long. It's huge. And so when you're standing there, you feel like you're in this landscape. But as a painting, it reaches deep into our sensory memories of West Texas. I could stand in front of this painting and I can smell the ozone and the sage. I can hear the distant crack of thunder, not just as a snapshot, but as a cognitive impression of the spirit of a place. The buildings that remain still embody our history. It became who I am as a Texan, and it became part of me as an individual. These remote places where architecture and landscape came together. Not only about our history, but they're about our cultural memory, deeply rooted in our stories, our lore, and our mythologies. How our buildings were built from the land and were of the land. It was this idea of Texas that made me fall in love with architecture. So what does it mean to draw? In 2022, I was the Robert A.M. Stern Visiting Professor of Classical Architecture at Yale. Believe it or not, Yale did not require its architecture students to draw. It was an elective. So I was teaching the graduate design studio, And I named it The Land Between Borders. And that the project for the students was to design a new institute of Texan cultures. So what we focused on was this land when Texas was a republic that was neither a part of Mexico or a part of Texas, but this dynamic landscape in between that was full of diverse landscapes and cultures. We traveled 1,400 miles from the mouth of the Rio Grande at the coast to places like Roma, Texas, to the Hill Country, to Marfa, and beyond to El Paso, exploring the many landscapes and the cultural influences on Texas architecture. Upon landing in San Antonio, I handed each student a sketchbook to observe and to draw and to see and to begin to understand the relationship of man and his buildings to the landscapes in which we lived. We drew to understand place and material, and to understand the twisted tree and how that tree becomes a lintel, and how that lintel informs the character of a building. Many of these students had drawn buildings before, but none have ever drawn a landscape and didn't understand why we were drawing landscapes. So every place we went, we brought these sketchbooks and we filled them with this knowledge and understanding of place to bring them back to the studio at Yale and to the architectural solutions that speak to the culture and to the place. So my love of drawing came from my childhood. I had an aunt who was an artist. She lived at the end of Old Galveston Highway, just before the swamp. The old Galveston bridge had burned down many decades before. And as a child, she would take me on these walks down this old oyster shell road through the swamp. And you would think, this is just a swamp. But as an artist, she didn't see it that way. I mean, she pointed out the alligator nest. She pointed out the Spanish moss. She pointed out the orchids that hung from the trees. She pointed out the beauty of this place. And so she taught me to see. As I grew older, we had books laying around the house, like these old Humboldt travel journals that featured illustrations by Buck Shiwitz of Texas architecture in the 50s and 60s as it existed, and as it had always existed. And this was my idea of what Texas was. So what of art? Here we have a 15th century Botticelli as allegorical art, a palimpsest, layers of cultural memory and meaning erased and rewritten time after time. Memories on top of realities, on top of memories, on top of Renaissance, on top of Florentine, on top of medieval, on top of Roman. This idea of Europe shaped the American identity as well. Early American artists were also using European landscapes and mythologies as a basis for their art. This is Thomas Cole's Course of an Empire. But in 1836, a writer, Ralph Waldo Emerson, wrote a short book called Nature. It became the #1 best-selling book in American history. It was about transcendentalism, that we're at one with nature, and that nature is as close to God as we can come to in life. And it instructs us in every moment. In the 17th century, age of enlightenment, we were taught that we can only have knowledge through those things we experience. Human understanding is based on an understanding shaped by the laws of nature. For American artists at this time, influenced by nature, the Hudson River School began, where human beings and nature coexisted, where the poetic and artistic inspiration found no impediments, abandoning rationalism for emotion and feeling, where landscapes rose like great cathedrals into the realm of light, where only the deity seems to reside. a primordial image of American wholeness. The ideal relationship between humanity and the all-powerful nature. Nature as God's refuge to the poet hero. And the idea that by observing, by seeing, one will know God and one will know truth. America was vast and full of possibilities, and this view of ourselves shaped a nation of brotherhood, humanity, and ecology. It showed the natural majesty during a time of American expansionism in the West, searching for the balance between human expansion and the preservation of nature. These artists saw the manifestation of God in nature. This painting of Moran's Yellowstone so touched the American spirit of who we are, it created our first national park. And what's interesting about these paintings, these were an event back at the time. This painting was actually about as big this sits in the Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C., is as big as what you're seeing on the screen there. And these artists would travel around with these paintings, and they would be behind curtains, and the curtains would part, revealing to an awestruck audience the beauty of what the West really was. Other aspects of our society were depicted, such as the tempest of the Civil War and the bridges we would have to build once again to become a nation, literal themes that drove Winslow Homer's work. But for Homer, it was not about what he was seeing, but a constant and obsessive search. American artists carried on this tradition into the 20th century. Here we have N.C. Wyeth. And what John Ruskin called measuring the moods of nature. So we recently completed a project in the Brandywine Valley for Linda Bean of LL Bean. And I was up in Maine, and I gave Linda a call. I said, Linda, I'm here in Maine. I'd love to see you. And she said, well, we'll be down at the dock at 8 o'clock sharp. And so I went down to Port Clyde, and I was standing on the dock, and I hear this roar of this lobster boat in the distance, and this boat was just hauling, and I just knew it was just going to crash into the pier. And at the last minute, it cut the engines, and it drifted and just kissed up against the pier. And there was Linda Bean at 84 years old saying, hop in. So she took me over to her house over on Teal Island. And we walked into her front foyer, and she showed me this painting by N.C. Wyeth. And she had purposely left the door open. She said, now, turn to your left. And I turned to my left, and there was Black Spruce Ledge out in the water within view, perfectly framed by her front door. And so this is the island that she lived on, and N.C. Wyeth's painting of Island Funeral, one of his most famous paintings. And so this hung on her fireplace in her barn-like living room, and just this incredible painting. What was most fascinating was you ran around on the backside of the chimney, and you had his charcoal study for the painting. And so she took me on this tour of her little island, and she had this piece of paper that had probably 25 dots on it. And with each dot was the name of a painting and a different Wyeth, from Jamie Wyeth to N.C. Wyeth to Andrew Wyeth, and all the places that they had painted on her little island. So these regional modernists like N.C. began to study this intersection of the forces of where the sea meets the land. And that relationship between that landscape and man that shaped our American culture. There was an artist colony on Monhegan Island, Maine, where artists like Rockwell Kent, Edward Hopper, all of the Wyeths, and George Bellows all painted. George Bellows' father, who was an architect, taught him to paint. But Edward Hopper was probably the most interesting to me because of his way of seeing the landscape, not as a collection of objects, but of blocks of color. Most importantly, it was Edward Hopper's aesthetic strategies, synesthesia, or cross-century imagery. That ability, Walter Wells says, of an artist to have us taste what we see, hear what we feel, to give odorful color, melodious flavor, or a chill wind perceived as a wailing siren or a quivering blue light. Hopper was so good at this, he was known as the poet of silence. Most of y'all may have seen this painting here at the McNay. They were kind enough to let me put it in the book, just requiring that they have a copy of the book for their library. But what if architects could think like these artists? What if architects could convey and connect to these human feelings the way that artists do, but in their buildings? English art critic John Ruskin taught us to draw us to gain an empirical knowledge, an understanding through experiencing. To draw the leaf is to know the forest. And so many architects at this time were starting off as artists. Here we have Charles Platt, was an artist in New England, in a New England art colony, and lived and studied in the Cornish art colony in New Hampshire, along with Maxfield Parrish. He left and he went to study in France at the Académie Julian in Paris. He would soon change his placard from artist to architect. He developed the first measured drawings of Italian gardens and went on to work for Frederick Law Olmsted. At the turn of the century, Platt would become America's most celebrated architect. Maine architect John Calvin Stevens was a painter as well. Here is his painting kit. Stevens wouldn't merely paint landscapes for the sake of art, but as an almost ceremonial seeing of the sight. John Calvin Stevens was a natural choice to design Winslow Homer's studio in Maine. And refusing Homer's payment, he asked only in return that Homer give him a painting in return. And so it was said that he gave him a painting of his studio in the fog. I don't know if it's his exact painting, but I imagine it was very similar to this. So drawing was instrumental to the culture of the Northeast. Do you sketch? John Calvin Stevens would ask other architects. There will be no shortage of opportunity to improve your skills. This was so important to Stevens that he gathered other architects to paint with him. They called themselves the Prussians, friends like William Ralph Emerson and Robert Swain Peabody of Peabody and Stearns. Architects that were the first to formulate the first true American architecture in the shingle style. An architecture at the intersection of man and nature, built of materials of the land, wood, shingle, and stone. In Boston, this idea that architects should draw formulated America's first architecture school, based upon art and science. Samuel Chamberlain would become the first professor of drawing at MIT. American journals encouraged drawing and documentation to travel abroad for architects. There was Pencil Points at the University of Pennsylvania, the journal of the drafting room. Members contributing studies were drawing at how we observed was the nucleus of a practice. And learning the language of place was the basis for knowledge in architecture. MIT students like Cass Gilbert, the seeing and the understanding and the knowing. Cass Gilbert, of course, would go on to design Battle Hall at the University of Texas. There was Julian Francis Abel, the first Black American to graduate architecture school at the University of Pennsylvania. And another University of Pennsylvania grad, John Kell, was the desk mate of Louis Kahn, at Paul Cray's office. He would leave Paul Cray's office to go down to do site observation or administrate the construction of San Antonio's federal building. My first job here in San Antonio was working for Johnny Kell at Kell Munoz Wygotsky. In California, Ralph Waldo Emerson's book would continue to have an impact. Joseph Worcester established the arts and crafts movement influenced by Jack London's Call of the Wild and his good friend John Muir's musings on nature. And this is funny, this house is sitting in Piedmont, California. Does anybody know where Piedmont is? It's in the middle of Oakland, California. So that's what Oakland looked like at the turn of the century. But that's his house in nature. And one of his boarders was a young architect by the name of Bernard Maybeck. MIT graduate John Galen Howard would embrace this ideology and would take this idea of nature and drawing to the West Coast. He would head the School of Architecture at Berkeley, where he would teach luminaries like Julia Morgan, the first woman to attend the École des Beaux-Arts in France. And Mary Coulter, who as a child collected Indian drawings, hiding them from her mother when she burned anything Indian, fearing smallpox. Mary Coulter would go on to define the architecture of the West with her railroad hotels and national park buildings, capturing the spirit of place. Bertram Goodhue was a young architect from New York, would go to Boston and join a young artistic intellectual group called the Society of Arts and Crafts. He would soon decide to travel to Mexico and write a book called Mexican Memories, A Slight Sojourn South of the Yellow Rio Grande. Bertram's studies in Mexico had obvious influences at his work at the Panama exhibition in 1915, which reinforced this concept of regionalism and the recognition of culture and landscape in American architecture. This idea of regional identity took hold with architects like George Washington Smith. But George Washington Smith wasn't an architect. He as well was an artist who exhibited at the Pan American exhibition, exhibited with George Bellows, in fact. He created an artist studio up in Montecito, and his studio was so popular, people started coming to him to design their houses. I love this painting of George Washington Smith so much, I really wanted it in my book, and I called around and I found a gallery that had just recently sold it and said, can you please contact the owners and see if I can get permission to use this in my book? And they said, absolutely not. And so about a year ago, we have an office in Santa Barbara now, and I was in Santa Barbara interviewing builders and going through a George Washington Smith, and we turned the corner, and here was this painting. And I said, oh my God, I wanted to put that in my book. The builder said, oh, they let you put that in your book. But here, he went on to become one of California's best renowned architects. And with his assistant, Luda Maria Riggs, even designed the Maverick House across the street from the Argyle. So this is her sketch of the courtyard of the Maverick House. He would also be instrumental in the redesign of Santa Barbara after the earthquake of 1925. There would be other architects, like Lionel Price, who would contribute as a young man. But Lionel didn't just invent this architecture. It was an architecture that was deeply influenced by his travels abroad, by his experiences in Europe. And his deeply romantic expressions of Mexico were expressed in his paintings. He would go on to become the director of the Art Institute of Seattle and was heavily influenced by the landscapes of modern regionalists like Georgia O'Keeffe and Marston Hartley. So, to me, to take a photo is merely a transference of data, a capture versus a response. To draw it is to absorb it into my memory and make it a part of who I am as a person and as an architect. So, these are images from a sketchbook. Sometimes these sketches would be late at night when you have jet lag in Venice and can't sleep at 2 a.m. Or later as more developed sketches. This is of the Grand Canal. This is of Villa Capra or Villa Rotonda in Vicenza. And it was the people. This is of Egypt in the Nile. And places. This is Provence. It was monodic. It was the heat on my neck, the smell of lavender, of the adjacent field, and the song of crickets sending an electric current through the fields that I felt as I sat here painting this bridge. Small sketches from London, from a balcony in Athens, or studying for a project in Clarencetown, Long Island, Bahamas, and sometimes closer to home. And so these travels would influence us in our work. Here we have a dovecote in France and a library that we designed here in San Antonio. So many know that I do a lot of landscape paintings. And I don't do these paintings, just to paint. But it's the seeing, it's the understanding of landscape and how they influence our buildings. This is South Padre. And here is a project we did in West Texas a while back, and the study of the landscape, just kind of showing the series of looking at the canyon, rough canyon, where the house is going to be going in front of. Looking at the view back towards the landscape the opposite way. And then the design of the house that ended up occupying the site. And occupying it in a way that it becomes a part of the landscape. Here was a project in the Panhandle and the architecture that evolved from that. And the client's programming impacting the fact that he wanted to see these blue northers blowing across the Great Plains. But if you notice the little wine cellar down below, he wanted a place that if the storms got too scary, he could rush down and be safe, but have plenty of wine. So this is a quick sketch in a sketchbook of Moosehead Lake. And then the house that was informed by that setting. And then the house as it was realized in the landscape. A part of it, both in material and form. Here is, for a project just west of San Antonio, about an hour and a half, a painting of the range of hills around Utopia, and my sketchbook studying, trying to understand how this ranch house would fit into this landscape. And then the ranch house that ended up occupying the house, the site, and how the forms connected to the land. And the client's influences of travel. But even here, we see woods that could have been collected around the ranch. We see, some of them were, like the cedar planks that were supporting the roof, and the columns that were cypress columns that someone drifted down the Sabinal River 5 miles to be able to collect. And then the living room. And then you see this view of what I had painted earlier before the project began. Some of the spaces within. little cabin we were thinking about doing up on the hillside. Another painting of a landscape, the view looking off a site in Aspen, and then how we captured that view in a more modern house, which is fairly unusual for us. Sometimes you don't have the luxury of visiting a job site in summer, and here, I'm trekking through 2 feet of snow and trying to capture the idea of this place. And then the ranch house as it's set within the landscape. And then other ranches, as we study, how they end up blending within the land that they occupy. And places beyond, such as Montecito, and how the diversity of the work we do isn't just incidental. It's informed by these empirical understandings of landscape and culture and place. This is a project in Austin, Texas, and a series of little cartoons that we did to show the experiences as you move through the property to the house. You pass by a stable. And then to the final house on Lake Austin. And then some of the sketches that were done to show the owners what the spaces would look and feel like. This was kind of the client's mad scientist workshop that he wanted. Here for a ranch on the Pedernales River, looking for inspiration, I found this cypress tree that was just clinging to the rocks along the riverside. And so we designed this ranch that clung to the bluff overlooking the river and tried to capture that spirit. Interior. Spaces abroad, places abroad. I like landing in Spain at 2 a.m. and not being able to sleep and doing a quick sketch of the mountain village overlooking where you're staying. And having a charrette to design a village next door and trying to understand how you capture what belongs. And this is the street of housing that we designed for that village. Housing we designed for Inverness, Scotland. A small boutique hotel in the Bahamas. Or housing in Mecca, Saudi Arabia. And so these projects begin with this germ of an idea. We do what's called what's often called a charrette, where we would travel to meet up with the client, and we would have this intensive workshop where we'd try to find out everything we can about what they want, and we would sit down with the client, we'd just begin drawing, pulling ideas out of the air. And so these are these germinations of these ideas seated in our mind of what this project could be. And I want to show you these because I think by working with the client to come to this understanding, we're able to take these seeds, this germination of an idea, and see them fully realized. This is the project as it goes into schematic design. And then as it gets further developed, this is Mac White's lovely drawing of the tower that was to be built. And then the realization of the project. You may notice the only thing missing is the chapel on the right-hand side, which is the second phase of the project. And then Mac's drawing for the interior of that chapel, which is now in construction documents, I'm happy to say. Another charrette at the University of Arkansas. The first day, showing the client, well, we feel like it should be like this, and then seeing that in schematic design, and then seeing the final building realized. Another project for the same sorority up in Ohio. Our project in the Brandywine Valley, starting out with a charrette sketch, having that begin to get developed, trying to do an assembly hall adjacent to a residential headquarters for an institution, but doing it in a way that belied its mass and form and integrated it with the house. And so this was the final project. Happy to know that our team just won a design award in Philadelphia for this project just a couple weeks ago. Sometimes it's just trying to understand architectural language. This is for a project in Windsor, Florida, working with the client to develop, her parents had developed this whole beautiful community, and it was now her turn to take it to the next generation and trying to discover a language that she can create of her own. Sometimes that language is for larger purposes, like this campus, this business campus in Austin, Texas. Sometimes you work in a country that has no real developed architectural style or heritage, and so you have to create an architectural style that feels as though it belongs. So this is a project we did in Costa Rica. We were involved with the planning of the community and then eventually building some of the houses. This is the house you just saw drawn as it was completed, sitting between the jungle and the ocean. A project in Montana, a series of experiences moving by the stable up to the main house, and then to the lodge looking out over Glacier National Park, informed by the national park architecture. It's the stable and the little cottage sitting in the orchard. So this thinking of the architect, this pulling out, using the pencil as this instrument, as this direct connection to our brain, how does that work? It starts with just these noodles, these trying to grab a hold of this thing you're seeing in your head and begin to develop it and form it and shape it into something that's real. So this is a ranch house in Telluride. And then my final drawing for the design of that house. This is a project we're just wrapping up and, outside of Fort Worth. And my sketchbook, looking at the landscape. And then trying to conceive of the architecture that would occupy that landscape. And then beginning to develop the materiality and the understanding that we were going to be using this stone that was half a mile down the road from where we were building this house. And then, as that house is finally being realized in the prairie. This is a project we recently completed in Pasadena, and fortunately it barely just survived the fires. This is the design for the residents. And then, apologize, these are just iPhone pictures. We haven't photographed this yet, but the house as it's realized. This is a house that was a really fun project in Baja, Mexico, looking out towards the Sea of Cortez. And so I get to the site, and there's this large pile of boulders. I guess the Indian gods threw their trash over here as well. And there was this wonderful boulder that had this little cave kind of etched into it by the wind. And so we tried to take inspiration from that pile of boulders and think about this plan for this house, this idea of this house that you climb on top of and through and around and within. And so the design as it began developing for this house, this is the street side, the other side was the ocean side. And then as it was finally realized, this house was in Architectural Digest this last summer. This is the front door you enter through and enter into this other world of the courtyard. A tower that you can go up and watch sunsets from. Swimming pool. And moving throughout this masonry core of this house. It was carving it like a piece of marble. And occupying even the rooftops. and within the tower. This is a project. This one actually was just published online by Architectural Digest this week. We don't have exterior shots of this yet, but a house in Austin that was just recently completed. So we talked about the Brussians. We all went through the pandemic in our different ways, and I came out of the pandemic with our own kind of sketch club of 4 colleagues. We call ourselves the Whiskey Watercolor Club. But we recently, it was interesting, we travel a lot together. We sit on these different boards together. We travel a lot together, and we took this trip to India, and we said, let's bring our sketch books and watercolors and let's sketch. And so we did that, traveling around India, getting into shenanigans, but sketching everywhere we went. Sometimes quick and rough sketches, sometimes more studied sketches, and really enjoyed sketching together and seeing the landscapes together and creating these experiences together because we were sketching together. And so having this amazing time, and we had 1 week to go, and the president shut down travel because of the pandemic, and we had 1 day to get out of India. And so we all hastily booked our flights back to the States, and before we got on the plane, said, well, what are we going to do? Our offices are going remote. How do we stay in touch during the pandemic? And one of the wives said, well, why don't y'all just Zoom every Sunday and paint together? And so that's what we did, and it was really formative to paint for the sake of painting. And not because it's a project. And so we did things like copy John Singer Sargent's ability to capture the translucency of light, or Francis McComas' ability to use blocks of color, or Augustus Osborne Lampo's ability to capture atmosphere. This is Hog Falls by Fritz Thalo, and here you see the 3 of us capturing it in different ways. One capturing the atmosphere of the painting, the other capturing the movement, and my attempt to capture the transparency of water. And so we thought the pandemic was over, and we took a trip together to Santa Fe to paint. It turned out it was only like a week reprieve from the pandemic, and we were all since scattering back to remote offices again. But we had this moment where we all met up and painted in Santa Fe. And so, it was a different experience because for the first time we were painting in this atmosphere where as soon as you dipped your brush into your palette and went to the painting, your paint had already evaporated. And so this idea that painting outside of a studio environment had a whole other complete set of challenges that taught you about nature. Sometimes it was Ireland in the rain, or Italy, where I was this last summer, painting with the Whiskey Watercolor Club. And then when we were in Italy, we took a short course by a figure painter in Rome who was teaching us to paint the figure. And what was interesting about this is she wouldn't let us draw it. She said, you have 20 minutes to use your brush to capture the light on these forms. And so it was an amazing exercise. And what it taught me is, here you see on the left, my arrival in Rome, my sketchbook where I sketched the Piazza di Popolo, and then I filled in the color of the watercolor. And then on the right, my parting drawing before I left Rome, where I did not draw anything, I just used my brush to capture the scene. And so this ability to really create this direct connection between what you see and what you put down with your hand. So before the pandemic, I wanted to build a studio in Maine. I have a small house on an island in Maine. And so this is what I envisioned. I didn't get that. I got a room. But as luck would have it, this room was finished just before the pandemic. So I had a place to paint when I set up in Maine for weeks at a time on Zoom meetings. This is a view right outside my studio window, a quarry down the road from my house, a lighthouse around the point, the harbor, the woods in winter. And so each drawing from nature began to train my eye to understand my environment, where you learn from nature about color theory, perspective, light, composition, translucency, reflectance, texture, form, contrast, and complexity, and atmosphere. So, I'm fortunate to work with some amazing people in my office. My partner, Mac White, strongly believes in this culture of drawing, and we have a lot of people in this office that work in our office because of the strong culture of drawing and what it means to their development as architects. And so every Friday morning they get together and they have what they call Friday Sketch Club. And they get together and they sketch together. They pick a subject or a challenge, and they learn from one another in sketching. And so these are some of the sketches that come out of those quick 15-minute sketches that they do in the office every Friday. And then often they go out in the world and they create sketches of their own, like this beautiful sketch of from Jim Linehan. And some of you may recognize this beautiful sketch Jim did. And then how that informs Jim's work in the office, such as this writer's camp and the Appalachian Mountains of Ohio and the interior of that camp. And then a recent project in Montecito, my sketchbook again. This is a big sketchbook. It's about this big, folded out as you see it. And me sitting up at the site, sketching the site, beginning to understand it, beginning to understand how the house should sit on this site and fit within the landscape. And then the design of that house as it fit on the property. We were fortunate. The big blue rectangle you see is a historical reservoir designed by the Olmsted brothers. And then the house as it's being realized. And we have dozens of sketches of this project, but this idea of being able to walk the client through the experiences that they would have on this property, from the outside gardens to the interior of their spa under the house. This is a project in St. Augustine, Florida, and a master planning project up in Michigan for Hillsdale College. And our ability to show the client a vision of what they can have. This is a hotel that we've just recently started. We're in design development for. And this is a new library addition that we're doing to the central quad, the front, and then the back that steps down with the ceremonial stair. Now, one of the things I wanted to point out about this is that these aren't watercolor drawings. These are computer drawings. But they're informed by the eye of the artist. This is a computer drawing looking up at the bottom of the undercroft of that building as it moves towards the monumental stair. And you see, this actually did not have an easy button. Took quite a while to work out on the computer, but this series of vaults underneath that the students move from the central quad down to the East Campus and move under. And then, how we're building those vaults using Bovadero from Mexico. This will be the largest freestanding vault project in the United States in at least 75 years. And one of our employees, Nathan Waltz, actually went to Terlingua to take a workshop to learn how to build these vaults, and actually helped execute this very mock-up at the campus. This is a drawing of the interior of the space, one of Andrew Gander's beautiful drawings, another of Jim Lanahan. And this arcade connecting down to a southern library addition that connects to what we call the heritage room that we're in schematic design with. The other building starts construction in March. And then Jim Lanahan's drawing of the interior of that space. And then, again, playing with the computer, using the computer to create a drawing that looks like 18th century architect Joseph Gandy's work, creating this kind of spooky effect. And then here's a project. I was just here day before yesterday in Alice Beach, where we're using the computer to create drawings in the style of Viennese architect Otto Wagner. And then that project, as it is under construction yesterday. A computer drawing of a tennis pavilion in Missouri. And so again, not letting the computer tell us how to draw, but letting the artist inform the computer, using the computer as a tool to get the effect that we're wanting. And so this is a drawing that looks very much like the paintings of 19th century William Walcott, who did a lot of the renderings for a very well-known architect in London, Sir Edwin Lutyens. It's got all the emotion, it's got all the inference, but this is actually an AI drawing. And so AI is getting good, but when I think about the ability of what machines can do, there's one thing I know that it can't do, is when I'm sitting out on a site, like for this project in Santa Fe, that as I'm sitting on a stone, I feel the sun on my back, I hear the high hawk calling, and I smell the cedar and the sage, as I imagine a home that will forever marry with the spirit of the land. And that's why, as an architect, I draw. Thank you.